Welcome back to Decouple. Today we're recording in, I guess, the home studio here in Toronto. And I'm joined by a very special guest. You may or may not see a little bit of family resemblance here, but I'm pleased to debut a big Decouple fan. I think you've listened to all the episodes.
Oh yeah, primal Decouple fan.
Given lots of feedback. You've always been a very supportive parental figure. So let's pull off the drapes here. My mother, Janice Kulyk Keefer, is joining me today on Decouple. So Mom, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I'm delighted to be here.
You know, and the reason I brought you on is because we've had a lot of great discussions. You've given me a lot of feedback over, I don't know where we're at now, the catalog, the 100+ episodes. And, you know, I've always been a little bit of a anti-intellectual rebel. Sadly, I shouldn't say always, but for much of my early life, you know, you yourself are a professor of English with a really broad cultural, historical, philosophical knowledge base. You have a PhD in English literature. You're probably going to heap the praise on me later, so let me just start there. And I really have not paid enough attention or taken advantage enough of the knowledge that you have, and so I'm aware of a lot of, you know, names of thinkers. Like you could say Immanuel Kant, and I know that guy's name, but I have zero idea of what his contributions were. And we were sitting around the table, and I've been thinking a lot about environmentalism, and really thinking that it's maybe is better described by something like eco-romanticism in terms of a lot of the nostalgia that drives the movement. And I was asking you, so what is romanticism, right? And that's kind of the origins of why I'm bringing you on the show now. And I'm going to do a little bit more of a kind of topic introduction, but I've been going on a little at length here. I want to give you a chance to introduce yourself a little more.
Really? You're not going to do that to me.
It's equal opportunity here. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Okay, I'm a retired university professor. I'm also a writer, probably a retired writer by now. And my background is Eastern European. My family background is Ukrainian and Polish. I studied German at university. And I did an English literature degree without once doing a course on Romanticism, so I'm really here under false pretense. I mean, I've acquired a certain knowledge of the literature and certainly the visual arts and the music of the Romantic period. But I'm not a trained scholar in Romanticism, so there'll probably be lots and lots and lots of bloopers, sure. But you know, I'll give it my best shot.
Well, you've certainly done your homework. When we were planning this episode, you probably spent like a month and a half reading up. You wrote a 30-page essay, which you shared with me, so that was a good primer. Okay, so again, I mean, the reason that I was so interested in doing this, you know, on Decouple, we kind of talk about the science and technologies that can decouple human well-being from ecological impacts, etc. But a lot of it is about the politics and also like. We started episode 1 with Jesse Freeston, introducing this concept from Charles Mann, this great book, The Wizard and the Prophet, looking at the sort of archetypes within environmental thought. And I was really drawn to those in the early days of Decouple, and I think it's important for me to always kind of go back there because we exist in this time of hyperpolarization where, you know, social media is really deconstructive, and we can really accentuate our sort of tribal affiliations and dogpile on people, and it's not a constructive way. And ultimately, you know, for us to face our collective challenges, we do need to reach some kind of consensus, and that has been something that's exciting for me in terms of finding ways, you know, as a someone whose origins are on the left, to communicate across the political spectrum, for instance. But a great way to humanize people that you disagree with is to understand that we all stand on the shoulders of giants, and that we attach a lot of our ego to the arguments we make. When we understand you know, whose shoulders we stand on and how unoriginal we often are, you know, adding that grain of sand onto the mountain of thought that's come before us, I think it gives us the humility to not be so attached to those ideas, to be a little more forgiving of those that we disagree with. So again, that's the motivation here. You know, having that vague sense that there's something a little bit, something a little bit wrong with the romantic framework, with letting it drive our policy choices too far, with having, I think, been a bit of a romantic myself. I wanted to dive in further. So I don't know. Why don't we start just by talking a little bit about Romanticism, small R and big R Romanticism.
Okay. I think it's really important to distinguish between what I would call small R Romanticism. We talk about things being romantic. I just saw the most romantic movie or a romantic relationship. And by that, we don't even mean an erotic relationship. We mean sentiment. We mean feeling. Mm-hmm. We mean often the realm of the counterfactual, the illusions that we can spin. Sometimes we dismiss something as being small or romantic because it's slushily sentimental, and it is counterfactual. It goes against what we know about the human experience, right? At other times, it can be even a positive term. It's, oh, that dress is such a romantic dress. It makes me think of, whatever, hearts and flowers and only pure thoughts and kind of thing. Although it's not terribly positive, but anyway. So I don't want to engage with that small R Romanticism, which is generally a pejorative term. But romantic, capital R as an adjective, derived from Romanticism, which is an actual historical movement that is a global phenomenon at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th centuries, is to me a fascinating cultural movement, partly because, like all cultural and historical movements, its origins are in opposition to the prevailing or the orthodox opinion and belief system that comes just before it. So we're talking about the Enlightenment, and we're talking about in the arts neoclassicism, where there's a kind of worship of Greek and Roman architecture and the notion of very fixed and rigid categories for constructing art or for thinking about the world. Mm-hmm. And one of the Romantic poets, a German poet, Novalis, who, like most of the Romantics, died at the age of 28, anyway, just critiqued what classicism and the Enlightenment had done to poetry. He said it stripped all of the idealism, all of the yearning, all of the depth from poetry, and it's made it kind of mechanistic and extremely boring. And when I think of somebody like Alexander Pope, the 18th century English poet, who said very famously that the proper study of mankind is man, then I think that gives you a very capsule idea of what that 18th century Enlightenment scientifically based culture was doing. I mean, it was looking at the human, it was looking at the social, it was looking at the collective. It was not looking at the individual and the subjective. And that's what Romanticism leapt towards. It was an embrace of the solitary wanderer, for example, leaving cities, civilization, and the norms of culture to go off into a context like the woods or the mountains, to be alone, to commune with the wilderness, to find what was inwards. There's a word in German, Innerlichkeit, that which lies within us. Mm-hmm. And that was what the Romantics were trying to tap into, in distinction to Enlightenment and classical thinkers and artists. That what lies within us is also what lies under the surface. So we're getting here into the realm of the mysterious, the sacred, if you like, the primal energy and urges that polite society and social conventions strive to cover up and to put a sort of damper on. Mm-hmm. So there was something incredibly freeing about the Romantic movement. It was a movement very much of young people. They were really wanted to kick the shins of their elders and bring down their authority. And it's very much like the 60s and the counterculture movement, kicking out. And like after the First World War, there were, as a German youth movement, the Wandervögel or the wandering birds, who went hiking in the mountains for throughout whole summers and basically just trashed the culture of their elders, the old men who brought Germany to destruction. I
think my rather simplistic understanding of Romanticism was like in reaction to the dark satanic mills of the Industrial Revolution, that William Blake poem, I think about my own life, and we have an episode up, kind of a holiday episode about my life pre-MD, and I very much went on this romantic journey, which probably
finding yourself
put a
a
few,
solitary wanderer, driving your mother crazy with worry.
Put a few gray hairs on your head and some wrinkles on your brow, but I can very much relate to that. And for me, it was this, rejection of modern civilization. It's a narrative I can really relate to, and so. Thinking about modernity and industrialization, and particularly kind of some of the horrors of that, this kind of messy stage of, the dark satanic mills, the factories, the pollution, the poor nutrition of the workers and things like that. For me, that's kind of how I understand that response, right?
Well, it's important also, I think, to realize that in turning away from those factories and polluted cities and child labor in factories, you're turning away from the social, the collective, the common good. And it's interesting that after the Romantic movement in the later 19th century, you get all kinds of movements which are dedicated to reform, sanitation, proper housing for the poor. So Romanticism is very attractive in certain respects because it does free the individual, but it also frees us from having a social conscience and grappling with problems about how does the human animal, the zoon politikon, who only thrives within a culture, within a community, how do we thrive as a human species and as cultures, as opposed to solitary individuals who could go off, and worship the moon on a beautiful kind of moonlit night and think deep thoughts. So the other thing I think about Romanticism is in turning away from the Enlightenment and from scientific discoveries and values, you're also turning away from the use of reason. And there's a famous Goya, the Spanish 18th century painter, engraving "The sleep of reason creates monsters," and it's basically this 18th century dude in a frock coat, 18th century costume, and he's lying down with his head in his arms, and there's a kind of thought bubble or dream bubble that comes out of his head, and there's all these creepy witches and demons and monsters, because you are letting loose the stuff of primal myth, okay? When you say goodbye to reason. And also when you say goodbye to the collective, you're following the individual trajectory of imagination and originality, and the Romantics prized subjectivity and originality above everything. And you began by saying, quoting Newton, "We are dwarves standing on the shoulders of giants." The Romantics felt that we can get back, if we only go deep within ourselves, we can discover amazing things. And for the German Romanticism, what they were talking about was two words, which I love in German: ungeheuer und unheimlich. Ungeheuer means the tremendous, not the little nitty-gritty stuff of scientific experiments, perhaps, or what you see under the microscope, but the huge things. And unheimlich is the uncanny, the stuff things that go bump in the night, the things which wake us up, the stuff of nightmares. And if you enter those regions, then you're freeing yourself from the constraints of reason, and you're able to put together all kinds of weird ideas and associations that can create new ideas. And if you think of Freud's dream theory, or just the whole idea of the way your mind works when you dream, when reason is asleep, and all these weird connections come, and you think, if you remember your dreams and you wake up, how did I connect that with that? But obviously you're doing dream work. And so I don't want to downplay the value of that, but what I do want to contest is when we fail to be critical or to step back from those dreams, from those mythic archetypes or prototypes, such as nature worship, such as kind of, as the Romantics did, ascribing a sacred or divine nature to the natural orders, and so that humans are a kind of impurity, a kind of blot on that, and should not be allowed near it. We shouldn't use natural resources because that is a sacrilege on nature which we should venerate. Right. And it's like, when you're looking at certain paintings, if you stand too close to them, you cannot see the pattern. You step back and you suddenly see the relationships of this mass with that mass, and you can see an image that comes into focus that you had no idea was there. And I think that's that can be very true when you're looking at certain elements of German Romanticism, which had to do with Germany's position as what we call now Germany. In the Romantic period, and before that, was just a collection of maybe 300 small German-speaking states.
Before we dive into German, because we're going to talk a little bit about, get into the specifics of a couple Romantic traditions, the German Romanticism. We had Noah, oh God, I'm blanking on his name. It'll come back to me in a second. But we had Noah on recently to talk about this kind of paradox within Germany of this kind of hyper-engineering state, science, technology, engineering, math, strength, coupled with this mysticism and Romanticism. And we're gonna get into that a little bit to help understand things like the Energiewende and the current sort of choices that are being made in Germany, the philosophical basis for those choices, and we're going to look a little bit at the Anglo-American as well. But you were mentioning a lot of Romanticism is about ideas about nature and returning to something good and primordial, Garden of Eden-like. But as we're defining some terms, as you've done with Romanticism, let's talk a little bit about concepts of nature. We had Alan Levinovitz on to talk about his book Natural, Deconstruct the Naturalistic Fallacy. His definition of natural was very much that which has not been impacted by humans, or is not the creation of humans. In the sort of show notes that you shared with me, you went a little deeper and looked at the concept of nature over time. So why don't you walk us through that a little bit? Because I think it's very interesting how that's changed in terms of the etymology of the word and how it's
So we're talking
changed.
basically about the interface of nature and culture, except that every time you use language, you're using culture. So even our word nature, you have to unpack. I mean, there's no way that we can visualize or verbalize the natural world without bringing in human constructs. So this idea of, if you remember that famous Joni Mitchell song, Woodstock, we've got to get ourselves back to the garden being the Garden of Eden, or in classical terms, the golden age when nobody had to work and nobody fought with anybody else, and fruit just dropped into our mouths, and it was paradise, right? That's kind of like the golden lining whenever we say the word nature, because we have this, we make sense of our world through not just ideas, but through mythologies, to explain stories that explain things. And also our desires. We want to get back to the garden. We want to have a relationship with nature which is not exploitative and which is not destructive. And yet we are in nature and we can't get out of it. We are, as human beings, we are part of the natural world. And through the history of human culture, there have been times when human beings have tried to place themselves outside nature, or kind of swim into the stream of nature, as the Romantics did. But if you begin with the ancient Greeks, if you're talking the Western tradition, you've got I think the Mycenaeans talked about something called Maka or Maga, which becomes Gaia. And I'm thinking here James Lovelock, a kind of interesting link. But that's like the basis, the mother, the foundation of everything that is. And then when you get to Aristotle, also a Greek philosopher, classical dude, he basically talks about physis, or physis, which is getting all of that, everything that exists, everything that surrounds us and is part of us, into one singularity, and that is physis. When the Romans start intervening here, and they're thinkers, they talk about something called natura, which comes from the Latin word natus, or birth. So that which gives birth to us, that which the originary. And again, there's a lot of mythic romanticism that goes into origins, whether it's organic farming down the line, but getting back to what is original, that is which is pure and has had no contaminating human presence. When Christianity kind of volcanically shakes up the cultural scene, you have the notion of the creation, and God creates the world, and the world includes nature. But there's also the sense of you have a heavenly realm above and you have a demonic, hellish world below, and then there's nature sort of sandwiched in between. And you get the talk about Mother Nature, and nature as some kind of fecund, fertile force, but which is nevertheless subject to divine law and will. So there is a concept called continual creation, in which God every day recreated nature, gave it, the oomph to keep going. So nature was dependent on the divinity. In the 18th century and with the scientific revolution, you get the notion of God as the divine watchmaker, and the natural world, creation, is a watch, this magnificent, complex mechanism. And what we have to do as humans is step away from that nature, that watch, and admire the handiwork of the creator and see how it works. And this is what the Romantics are fighting against, this mechanized concept of us being a part and looking on. They didn't want to watch, they wanted the deep, dark forest. They wanted moonlight. They wanted mystery. They wanted awe, the tremendous and the uncanny, the mysterious. All the things which the light of reason, rationalism, the empiricists, the scientific revolution had pushed to the forefront. So you get to the Romantics, and you also get to a concept of nature which is mythical, highly mythical and highly emotive. Beyond Romanticism, when you get to the later part of the 19th century, you get Darwin, and you get the discovery of evolution, and you get a demystification with bells on and knobs on, because suddenly the Christian fundamentalists are up in arms. What? The world is not just 5,000 years old, it could be millions of years old, and there's a shake-up there. Now also we get into the difference between what we call nature and what we call the environment. And I think in some ways nature has become a kind of anachronistic term, because we talk about the ecology, we talk about the environment, environmentalism, the globe, the planet. And nature has all this baggage that comes from the Greco-Roman world and the medieval Christian world. But nevertheless, we start thinking of nature in terms of the environment. And if you unpack the word environment, it turns out that the word comes from French 14th century usage. There's a verb environner, which means to encompass or to englobe or to contain. So something that delimits, not something which is everywhere and all around us. Then you get the English philosopher and historian Carlyle in 1827 using the term environment to mean the attributes of everything that is around us, in our culture or whatever. Then you get I think the date that environmentalism hits the world in terms of the sciences is 1956, and environment means environmentalism, the relation of living things with their natural surroundings, right? And
because it's not like naturism. It really reflects that the relationship between human beings and nature. That's why we chose the word environmentalism. Like that's what's fascinating too. Is like, why do we make the linguistic choices that we do? Why do we choose the words that we do? And I'm loving this background.
But then there's also and then it bounces back. And do you have an anthropocentric view of nature, or do you have an ecocentric view of nature?
Right.
Can you actually have an ecocentric view of nature, given that you are a human observer using human constructs and human mythology to talk about the natural world? And here's where the English come in, and the American use of environmentalism and kind of currents environmentalism. In English Romanticism, William Wordsworth, the early 19th century poet, is a huge figure. He wasn't a rustic peasant or anybody. He was an educated, although kind of broke gentleman, who just in the search of a simple life close to natural world goes off with his sister Dorothy to live in what was then a pretty inaccessible wild area of England called the Lake District. And basically he wanted to get away from, first of all, classical poetry, 18th century neoclassical poetry, which was so overwrought, which was so sophisticated, which had no ties with ordinary people in ordinary life. So he wanted to write in simple, plain English. And he wrote about rustic people and peasants in the Lake District, but he also wrote about how living close to nature can renew and regenerate you, that there's some kind of sacred purpose that comes out of a life close to nature, reflecting on this and simplifying as much as possible. And there's a famous part of a poem by Wordsworth that I'm sure you will recognize. I'm sure that I could not have raised you as a son without exposing you to some English poetry, but my heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began. So is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old or let me die. The child is father to the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each in natural piety. Now, those last two words, natural piety, I think are absolutely key. That's what American nature writers like Emerson and Thoreau, and later figures like John Muir, who formed the Sierra Club and was instrumental with Ansel Adams in preservationist environmentalism, that's what they take to heart. Nature is not just something that we observe or study or enjoy. We revere it. We venerate it. It's sacred. And it's a sacrilege for humans to intervene.
So we're getting into the Anglo-American tradition. Let's jump into the German tradition, because I think maybe it predates it slightly. Yeah. And it's very fascinating. You were hinting a little bit. We were talking earlier again about this paradox within the German sort of cultural psyche between the kind of the engineer and the romantic. It's a land of homeopathy, of organic agriculture, as well as Mercedes-Benz, Siemens. And I mean it's interesting because
armaments.
And that's not like unique to a country, right? I mean, you think about just undifferentiated students, what they choose to go into, what fields of study they go into, and people go into STEM, and people go into literature, and people go into humanities, etc. So there's within us, I think there's romantic tendencies and modern tendencies, however we want to break it down. But let's dive a little bit into that sort of history of German Romanticism, and I think you really think about it in terms of how the national origin of Germany comes into being, and why
the intersections between history, culture, and myth. And we have to go way back. I mean, one of the most sacred elements of the natural world for Germans is the forest, der Wald. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote a book called Germania, and in it he described the values and lifestyle, I guess you would call it, of the ancient Teutonic tribes or ancient German tribes, the ones who were never colonized by the Romans. And they were warriors. They had a simple warrior culture with noble virtues. They were never contaminated by civilization. They didn't even live in cities. They lived in little forest huts. There was a kind of purity of life, but there was also, Tacitus says, they did not intermingle with other tribes. So they had this kind of racially pure bloodstream. They lived close to nature. They had neither, he said, wine or letters, books. So there was something very pure and simple about them, and almost childlike, Wordsworthian, so it wasn't when I was a child close to nature. My heart beats faster when I see an oak tree. Oaks were sacred to the ancient Germans. Now, they resisted Roman imperial rule, and there was a prince of one tribe of these Teutonic guys called Arminius, and his father had been a German chieftain who was captured by the Romans, so his son was given the Latinized name Arminius and became the leader of Roman auxiliary troops. He was perfectly fluent in Latin, and he fought, alongside the Roman military until he was posted back to what we call now Germany. This is near the Rhine River. Something called the Hercynian Forest, which was at that time vast because it stretched from northeastern France to the Carpathian Mountains. Wow. Huge. Now, there was a part of this forest which the Germans revere as the Teutoburger Wald, the Teutoburger Forest. This was an area between marshland and there was an area in there between the deep, dark, dense, impenetrable forest and the marshland, which was, you didn't want to get in there, right? Because you just drown in the mud. When the Romans were moving camp from their summer quarters to the winter quarters, and they were under the leadership of this horrible, despotic, corrupt guy called Varus, general, who was Arminius's commander. Arminius suddenly remembers his German roots, And even though the Romans had decided that the ancient tribes were so simple, they didn't know craft or cunning, they were just innocent children, manly and warriors, but they would never, never, never do anything like ambush you. Arminius, when the 3 Roman legions, we're talking about 15,000 to 25,000 men, have reached this impasse between the marsh and the impenetrable forest, Arminius somehow tricks them, leads them, lures them into the Teutoburger Wald. And guess what? They're stuck in the middle of this forest, and they can't form their famous shield formation, and they can't throw their javelins the way they used to. And suddenly they're being attacked by these German warrior guys who are using guerrilla warfare, right? And they're slaughtered, they're massacred. There's only a very, very few of these legionaries who are able to make it back to the camp and tell their Roman cohorts, we were massacred. Varus commits suicide, he falls on his sword. He's been so disgraced because he's lost these 3 legions. And it is the worst defeat in Roman military history. It's just massive. Now, never mind that a couple of decades later, a German general called Germanicus studies the tactics of Arminius and is able to defeat the German tribes.
Sure.
Nevertheless, the consequence of that was that the Romans did not colonize beyond the Rhine. So there was this free Germany. So you can see how important that is for a national mythology. In about the 15th century, Arminius becomes Hermann. He's given a German name, I think by Martin Luther. Now
Herman
in English,
the German,
we say Hermann the German, which is great, but he would in German be Hermann der Deutsche. Hermann actually means warrior or man of the army. But he becomes tremendously important. And because Germany is never able to unite into a nation the way France is, the way England is, the way later on Italy is, but not for a long while, but it's just this collection of 300 states. They all speak German. There's also Austria, which becomes the Austrian Empire and is vast. But, there's all these little principalities and states, and they don't have a national history. They don't have an army, a German army. They don't have a navy. And that means that they're not massacring their forests to provide timber for warships, okay? So they have these huge forests. And they also don't have a national history, so they have a natural history. And that's what unites them. And this natural history is the lore, not just of the mountains, but of the forest. You have altars erected in the oak groves. You have Nordic mythology with the god Wotan, who hangs from the ash tree, the great cosmic tree, for 9 days and 9 nights. And then he uses his tremendous willpower to read these runes written on the stones, and he's able to get off that tree, and he's regenerated, and it's a rebirth myth. And all of this feeds into German Romanticism. The German Romantics prize the Middle Ages. Why? Because in the Middle Ages you had a coherent culture, you had people who lived close to the land, to natural rhythms. And you had also, in the forests, you had this amazing forest economy. You had peasants. It wasn't the forest primeval that had never been touched by human hands. There were altars, people were worshipping in there, people were living in the forests, or they had villages on the edge of certain woods. And the woods weren't deep and dark. They had been cleared for grazing in some areas and thinned out. It was absolutely essential for the peasant economy, for peasant survival, for peasants to be able to go into those forests, gather firewood. They would actually cut down trees 5 or 6 feet from the ground level so that deer couldn't eat the kind of twigs and the saplings that were coming out. And they would use these saplings for making wattle, like that lattice of woodwork to make their houses. They would use it for firewood. They also used timber for charcoal, for smelting iron. But they had these wonderful sacred oak groves that every autumn would allow millions of acorns to descend, and they'd let their pigs pasture there from the beginning of autumn till November, and then they'd slaughter their pigs and they'd live off that meat for the rest of the winter. So the forest was commercially absolutely primal. And the other thing was that the forest nurtured ancient myths, ancient legends, folk songs, what became known to the world as Grimm's fairy tales in the 19th century. And the German Romantic movement, it saw the Middle Ages as the source of authentic German culture, just as Arminius was the source of authentic German military values and the ancient Teutonic tribes of German bloodline. But they also, the Romantics, started gathering up folk song and folk music and legends for authentic German culture. Now, in 1806, Napoleon invades Prussia, and it's game over for nascent dreams of German nationalism. This is a huge blow. So, of course, German intellectuals, German philosophers, German poets and painters are going to seize on what they called the folk, das Volk. And they were the source, the uneducated people. They didn't have a university education. They weren't Frenchified with Enlightenment theories or scientific knowledge, but they could tap in. They had preserved this long kind of stream of legend and folklore and myth that gave Germans an authentic cultural identity because they didn't have a political one. So this becomes absolutely key. And I think another force that goes hand in hand with Arminius and medievalism and the deep dark world of the fairy tale, which is so mysterious and awesome, is a German fascination with the woods and the simple, manly life that gets a late 19th century expression in the works of the extremely popular German writer Karl May. He wrote a series of travel narratives, boys' books, I mean, you name it. And he was a really, really sketchy character. He was a convicted thief and a weird guy. But anyway, I think in his heyday, there were 200 million copies of Karl May's works in print, and the most famous of them were the Indian ones. He'd never ever traveled to North America.
The German fascination with native people. And there's like a whole like
reenactment
movement.
There's a subculture.
There's more. Apparently, there's more Germans that speak Oglala Sioux than native speakers in North America.
Absolutely, they're still but they were like key and. Two famous readers, devourers of the stories about Winnetou, this Apache chief, and his European white man blood brother, who was called Old Shatterhand or something. Two primal readers of these stories were Adolf Hitler and Albert Einstein.
Wow.
So put that in your pipe and smoke it. I mean, and it's important to point out also that Adolf Hitler apparently didn't notice that Karl May's writings were not anti-Semitic, and they treated non-Northern European people with sympathy and respect. Okay, Hitler took none of that away from it.
And what are the German Romanticism is coming of age again? Is it during the Industrial Revolution? And it's
because people want to get away from the smoke and the pollution of the cities, and they also want desperately to find some authentic source of German identity.
Right. So it's those two things.
And also, militarily, after Germany unifies in 1871, you have a German nation. Then you get the buildup of the Prussian military. And you get the Prussians defeating the French in the Franco-Prussian War. But then you get the First World War, and Germany goes down to defeat. And there's the humiliating terms of the Treaty of Versailles that are imposed on them. And again, Germans feel a sense of shame and humiliation. What brings them together? Well, it's this idea of nature. And nature and the natural world can be, as Michael Pollan, the amazing, wonderful American nature writer, says, an exit from history. You've got a traumatic nightmare history.
Right.
And this is true also of post-World War II Germany.
Yeah.
You go back to nature. You go back to that primal world. You exit from the nightmare of history, and that's what you seize on. So therefore, you get people reading Karl May and thinking, primal virtues, just like Arminius was this manly German who was able to defeat these decadent Romans, and they looked on him as a barbarian, but really, he was the source of all manly virtues. So Winnetou is like Arminius transposed to a North American context. So that continues, this German fascination.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was watching on Netflix, this is where I get my culture from, Barbarians, and it was just really interesting.
Can you just train that camera on that wall of books over there? Netflix versus the wall of books. Okay, sorry.
Sure. Anyway, there's the series called Barbarians, and it's the Herman the German story, right?
Yeah.
And as a lover of World War II movies and very fascinated by that history, seeing it's a TV series, 5 parts about like a good story about Germans, about resisting Roman imperialism, about this, like it really struck me because I hadn't seen anything that sort of celebrated German history, because there's been World War II, World War I, etc. It's certainly 20th century.
Anti-imperialist, what's not to like?
So that was definitely interesting. I'm not sure like how far into the present we go here in terms of this background.
I would go into this strange overlay, and it's a very tricky proposition of certain tenets in German Romanticism and German thought with Nazism and certain ideas of purity and authenticity, and what the Germans referred to as blood and soil, Blut und Boden. Those are the most authentic, the ground under your feet. This is what makes you who you are. And the dangerous part of this is saying, well, is every German environmentalist, or was every German environmentalist a Nazi? Yeah, one of the Hesses was, and also Hermann Göring. Who and the Nazis, I think in 1936, the special department, the Reich's Ministry for Naturschutz, or the protection of nature, was formed, and it was heavily conservationist, preservationist, largely because Göring was this kind of wacko hunter guy who just basically wanted to shoot everything that moved.
Well, you see that a lot with American conservatism. Ducks Unlimited have preserved an enormous amount of wetlands.
He wanted like to have a whole. When they invaded Poland, he wanted to take over the whole Białowieża forest
as a hunting preserve,
wow. and get rid of native Germans living there, or Poles. I'm sorry, native Poles living there, and fill it with Germans and German species.
No way.
Yeah, even though it's, the Białowieża forest is the home of the European bison. Is dwindling numbers. So anyway, but this idea of
that's fascinating, because there's this whole I think there's a lot of sort of fear of invasive species. You can make all sorts of analogies there.
And that was one of the things that one very important.
But you're moving German species into Poland to create
I know exactly. But this hugely important German environmentalist who was important after the Second World War as well as before it. I think his name was Alwin Seifert or something like that, and he was actually working in when they were constructing the Autobahn in the 1930s, the big highway, for ways to minimize environmental damage and to kind of harmonize this huge ribbon of concrete with the natural surroundings. Now he believed very strongly in the preservation of original species. There was another German conservationist who was part of this Reich's Department for Natural Protection, whose name I've forgotten, but he was dead set against two things. He was dead set against kind of promiscuous agriculture. He just wanted organic, pure farming, and the introduction of exotic species. Only native German species should be planted in Germany. He was also irate that when Germany lost its colonies in the First World War, it also lost the right to protect massive tracts of rainforest in Africa. Okay, so so there's all kinds of conflicting currents in this. But nevertheless, when the Nazis were talking about Lebensraum and living space for German colonists after they'd defeated Russia and sent waves and waves of German colonists, they talked to German conservationists for how to create natural settings, how to engineer the landscape. So there was this.
It's like what Albert Speer was planning on doing
with architecture.
They were planning to do to nature.
So it's kind of a double-edged thing, because absolutely one applauds conservationist methods, because we don't want the dark satanic mills to completely displace, streams and fields and mountains and all of that. But on the other hand, it's a kind of human intervention to serve an ideology which is based in a very dark set of myths, which talk about the purity of blood, which talk about the embrace of the irrational, which talk about the values of letting go of reason and civilized values and exploring that dark underworld.
What's interesting, talking what you're saying about, not wanting the dark satanic mills to sort of engulf all of nature, especially pristine areas of scenic beauty, these kind of aesthetic forms of a natural resource, is, talking Noah Retberg, of course, the very forest in which the grim fairy tales are situated, is now, they're building wind farms there, with these huge access roads. I didn't used to really understand what was involved in building a wind farm in a forest or natural area, but I mean, you have to cut really wide, sort of four lane sort of width roads to bring these turbine blades in. And so, with the new coalition government in Germany, there's a plan to accelerate the Energiewende, to get out of coal a little bit earlier. And that involves, really, they said, 2% of German land area needs to be devoted to basically wind and solar, and that threatens some of these primordial forests.
Well, it basically induces cultural schizophrenia, because you cannot preserve this veneration of the sacred grove, the sacred oak grove, and everything that Herman the German stands for, and just cut things down to put concrete windmills
and
in.
Not to mention the Jesse's recent Decoupled Studios episode, touring the lignite mines and seeing the villages and the forest being swallowed up as well. I mean, there's some tension going on here.
Some tension. Now, getting back to America, if you think of 1875, the newly reunited Germany erects this huge, kitschy monument to Arminius or Hermann.
Right.
It's on a huge column just on the edge of the Teutoburger Wald, and this Hermann is there with his helmet, and he's got his sword up and everything. Well, 11 years prior to that, in 1864, in the United States, in the middle of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln stops everything to sign into law a bill that consecrates Yosemite as an America and the world's first wilderness park. Why? For similar political reasons and mythical reasons, to help to create a national identity which is beyond sectarian conflict and which has its roots in the sacredness of primal nature.
Right.
And the special American relationship with an unpolluted, uncivilized, wild nature, which is what God gives to human beings. And one of the things that made Yosemite so special was the giant trees, the sequoias. And there's also a kind of segue back to the ancient German forest with their huge and massive oaks.
And of course, this is a national park that's depopulated or ethnically cleansed of its...
What's really interesting is the name Yosemite.
Yeah.
There were the Romanitc Indians who were moved out of there by force, and who had created what we think of as the natural, unhumanly touched Yosemite. They did controlled burns in order to create grazing land for their herds, and they are responsible for a lot of the way that Yosemite looks, the meadow of wildflowers, but then there's also sorry, I've lost my track here. The Awanichi Windows. Okay, they were expelled. Their name Yosemite comes from an Awanichi word meaning some of them are killers, Yochameti, whereas the soldiers who were expelling them said, no, Yosemite comes from a word Yokimote, which is a Miwok word for grizzly bear. Right. So you have two conflicting etymologies for Yosemite. So there's the shadow of killing and of extermination and racial, kind of cleansing in the consecration and dedication of this national park. So it's this paradoxical cultural schizophrenia thing again. This is Yosemite, which is, and again, when they talked about the great trees of Yosemite, they talk about Cathedral Grove. It was a religion of nature worship. But they talked about those trees, the sequoia, having been mature at the time when Christ was walking in Galilee and performing his miracles. So in other words, time vanishes, and there's somehow a link between contemporary America and the feet of Jesus walking in the Holy Land. And this becomes another way in which America is the exceptional nation. God has given, the Creator has given this wonderful, untouched, unpolluted world of nature to us.
Right.
Because we're the American people, and we will safeguard it.
Yeah, and it's not like a land without a people for a people without a land, but it kind of is as well. And we talk about that with Charles Mann, how, in South America and in Central America, there's a real understanding that, no, there were civilizations here before us. There was a lot of artifacts that were left in terms of Incan ruins and Mayan and Aztec ruins. Disease wiped out much of the 90-something% of all of the Americas.
You also have these Ontario frontier heroes like Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett, the king of the wild frontier, who I think Daniel Boone was instrumental in kind of the westward push into Kentucky and Missouri, creating that kind of path
to the west.
Paul Bunyan, I grew up with the myth of Paul Bunyan. As a good old Canuck, we didn't have any folk heroes, so we had to import American ones. He was 7 feet tall, and he had a blue ox named Babe, and I think he wore a coonskin cap. But I just recently, in Wikipediaing him, realized that he was actually a lumberjack. And in legend, he cut down millions of trees. Mm-hmm. And his myth was propagated through the Red Timber Company, I think it was, hiring a writer to write a publicity pamphlet to popularize Paul Bunyan. Mm-hmm. So here on the one hand, you have the myth of Paul Bunyan, the massive clear cutter. On the other hand, you have the deep ecology movement in American environmentalism, which is totally ecocentric, which says any human contact with nature is evil, and we have to step away. And we need to preserve our sacred ties to the land. Mm-hmm. Well, you can't have that land, you can't have a Yosemite without exploration and the westward push of settlement. You can't have exploration, as Alexander Humboldt, another German romantic figure who was hugely influential on American Romanticism, pointed out. You can't have exploration without development. Right.
You were talking earlier in our pre-chat about these figures like Paul Bunyan, and also why these frontier stories were so exciting to the Germans. There was back when I was much more interested in nutrition for some reason, I read this pretty fascinating book called Nutrition and I think it's called Nutrition and Degeneration, and it's actually written by this dentist who was very preoccupied with the fact that in World War I, something like 20 to 30% of potential conscripts failed their health exam. Yeah. In these earlier days of the Industrial Revolution, when people were eating just flour, molasses,
living in slums that saw no sunlight.
Yeah. There was a real fear amongst the elites, I think, of that the white race was degenerating, and there's all these stories of going to the New World and finding these incredibly vigorous and healthy people who later die of imported diseases, on contact they're muscular, they're tall, they're strong. And you were mentioning as well this sort of preoccupation amongst the elite as well. The elite was becoming kind of effeminate because of modernity and because
of decadence and
life becoming easy.
Cosmopolitanism and civilization. Yeah, right. Exactly.
No, I found that to be pretty interesting. Is there, in terms of the kind of Anglo-American, we've sort of leapt to Yosemite and things like that. Is there more to sort of fill in the blanks with Emerson, Thoreau?
They're big time.
I just learned that Thoreau, who had the cabin in the woods and waxed poetic about his bean garden, had sort of packed lunches from his mom. But is Thoreau important to understanding the story?
Thoreau's absolutely key. And
so give us the Coles Notes as someone who knows the name, but unfortunately didn't pay attention to his parents' learnings.
Well, Thoreau, first of all, Thoreau's mentor was someone called Ralph Waldo Emerson, who was an essayist. He had been a American Protestant minister who lost his faith in Christianity when his wife was dying of tuberculosis. That was when he would have these vigils by her bedside, he read Thoreau's essay on nature. And he became, sorry, wait a moment, that was Emerson reading, you can't be reading that. He read Alexander Humboldt. And Humboldt's account, his book Cosmos, which was trying to connect everything in the natural world. And
the Gaia hypothesis of the proto-Gaia hypothesis.
So Emerson, this Congregationalist, whatever minister, is reading Humboldt and thinking, nature is the divine power. Nature is what we should be worshiping. Nature is what consecrates our lives and gives our lives meaning. So he leaves his vocation as a minister and becomes a writer and lecturer. And, some of his values have to do with getting back to nature, with simplicity, with eschewing the kind of decadent civilization that has against which the New England values and virtues, which become something called transcendentalism, the idealism, against which idealism is opposed. So Emerson mentors this much younger man, Henry David Thoreau, to whom he lends a bit of land on his own property and near Walden Pond. And he said, you can construct a little house there and you can live there for 2 years. And just, take in nature, read, write, do all those things and reflect upon what is the relation between man and the natural world. So Walden goes off. Now, he doesn't have any financial constraints. Thoreau never married. He never had children. He was, I think, financially more or less independent, or certainly he was not trying to make a living off of growing beans in one field. And he was a gentleman. And he spent as much time reading and writing as he did cultivating his bean field and going for long walks. So he writes Walden, and it becomes, in the 1960s, a Bible for the counterculture movement.
And the Back to the Landers, right?
Back to the Landers,
right.
For the hippie communes. Also for civil disobedience and people resisting the draft into the Vietnam War. But he is very much a romantic. He is very much an idealist. And, he just thinks nature should be nature. Mm-hmm. And he tries to convert his neighbors, farmers who are trying to make a living off pretty hard scrabble land and to feed 10 children, saying, no, just take in nature, just, reflect on it and the beauty of nature. And a weed is just, don't pluck those weeds out of your wheat fields. Mm-hmm. They're just plants.
So is this romanticism thing kind of unique to the sort of elite
but
classes?
He also dies at the age of 40 of TB
right.
because he takes homeopathic remedies. Of
right.
course, everybody died of TB in those days, but nevertheless.
But he extols the homeopathic remedies. Because they're natural. So, is this romantic tradition sort of unique to the moneyed classes, to folks that can sort of afford to
absolutely,
be nostalgic?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because, and also in England, the heir of Wordsworth, whom I quoted to you, there were all kinds of thinkers, socialists, like an artist like William Morris, but one key figure is this guy, John Ruskin, who was independently wealthy. I think his father made his fortune in importing wine. And Ruskin was the great benefactor of artists and anybody who was striving to foster and implement the values that Ruskin held dear, which were the natural world and a simpler, purer way of being. And he has this hilarious passage where he tries to get the middle class and the upper class, not the aristocrats, because they're beyond redemption. They're so decadent and corrupt. But to get back to a simpler way of being, he says, move out of the cities, find some beautiful piece of land. We will allow no steam locomotives on this land, but we will have maypoles and garlands and children dancing on the green. But no mention of how people are supposed to earn a living, right? There's also people who are trying to create like craft communities and workshops and and William Morris trying, to create furniture that's not mass produced and that is using the best traditions of craftsmanship. So there's a lot of idealism there. But only wealthy people can afford this kind of furniture, and only wealthy people can afford to buy Ruskin's books and read them and try to implement his values. But Ruskin is hugely important, and Emerson and Ruskin sort of mingle, and Emerson becomes valued as an essayist in England, and Ruskin becomes valued for what he stands for in North America. But there's this tidal wave. I mean, Thoreau's Walden as a book, it was a kind of slow seller. It basically sold out its print run, and it never got reprinted until years later. It became a smash hit in the 60s. Right. And now it is like, now Thoreau is basically called the messiah of the American environmental movement. But what Thoreau is enshrining is these ancient myths, or this tradition of natural piety, whereby nature is not something that we learn to live with, to use in order, to benefit human beings, but also to respect. But nature becomes something to worship. Mm-hmm. And we don't meddle with God, right? So we don't meddle with nature. Right. And then in America, the beginning of the environmentalist movement there, you have people who are amazing figures like John Muir and Ansel Adams, for whom the Sierra Club, but also the High Sierra and Yosemite Park and everything become these, and it's just primal sites where you go and you regenerate yourself and you reestablish your contact with the things that really matter. But you can't get to those places unless there are roads. You can't get people into Yosemite to look at the great trees. I mean, first of all, logging companies and mining companies went there, and they cut down this huge sequoia, and they actually made a dance floor out of it.
Wow.
And they brought troops of tourists in to dance on the stump. And that's one of the reasons why in 1864 Lincoln decides we really better protect this area. So there are valid reasons for protecting it. But nevertheless, if you go to Yosemite today, and I have never been, but from what I've read on the website, there's all kinds of amenities for the tourist.
For sure. Yeah.
So how can tourism and worshipping nature coexist? It can't. Again, there's a kind of cultural schizophrenia.
Right. So let's kind of, I guess, close off a little bit by looking at how Romanticism has impacted the contemporary environmental movement, and some of its choices, I guess, around energy, around agriculture,
right.
These kind of things. So I guess that's more, in this globalized world now, maybe there's not such a difference between Anglo-American and German Romanticism and their modern environmental movements. But yeah, I guess we maybe summarizing sort of what we've talked about so far, and when you look at the contemporary environmental movement, how important is this romantic tradition to them? How entrapped are they by that thinking, and how reluctant does that make them to sort of look at other approaches? Right. We had Alex Trimbeth on to talk about modernity a little bit. This is kind of our Romanticism episode, but it's interesting seeing those two things. The death of environmentalism, the eco-modernism thing rising up. This interaction happening.
Well, I think first of all, we have to recognize that there are many, many different strands of environmentalism. There's environmentalism which is anthropocentric, which sees a place for a human relationship with the natural world, in which humans occupy the position of steward or sometimes protector of the natural world, but also in some way user of natural resources to foster human well-being. Mm-hmm. And all of us who are not hypocrites, who use cell phones, who go on our computers, know that without the mining of rare earth minerals, we couldn't do that. So we cannot be deep ecologists, eco-centric environmentalists, and still use a cell phone. It just doesn't work, right? There are people on the other end of the spectrum from the anthropocentric ones, the deep ecologists, of whom I think Dave Foreman is a prime example. I think he created an organization called Earth First.
Earth First, yeah.
But it's
Derek
basically,
Jensen.
and then there's also, which segues into something like the voluntary human extinction movement, which says we should just all die out and let the world just be the world. But, so there are gradations. But I think what is key in a lot of environmentalism is this notion of natural piety, that nature is something which strikes us with shock and awe. And that's the whole notion, again, in Romanticism of the sublime and of being awestruck by a mountain.
Oh, yeah.
Whereas previously, in previous eras, a mountain was just an obstacle, this is terrible. And the forest is just an obstacle. We want to put roads through here. And then the Romantics say, no, we want to worship this. Yeah. We want to return to, we feel guilt, okay? Mm-hmm. We feel guilt because, and it's maybe, a kind of eco version of the human guilt for genocide. Mm-hmm. Our genocidal treatment of indigenous peoples, the genocidal treatment of the Jews and homosexuals and gypsies by Nazis, all of the various forms of genocide that have gone on, that have been part of human culture. Because we human beings, there's a lot to be awestruck about human achievements and development, culture, the arts, science, but there's also a lot to be deeply, deeply ashamed of, right? Mm-hmm. So one way of an exit from that shame and from our history, the nightmare of history, as the famous Irish writer James Joyce put it, this trauma nightmare, is to open the door into nature and to try to make the human as small as possible, and to believe that even though we're using a linguistic term, nature, And we're depending on all kinds of myths that our culture has developed to frame nature, to understand it, to actually see it. The belief that we can just make ourselves so small that we don't interfere with it. And just leave it be. Let it grow. It's like a Disney, kind of film. And there's this tension. I don't know if we can ever get out of this dichotomy between wanting nature to flourish on its own terms and yet also wanting to be a part of nature. Wanting to step outside nature and control it in some ways, because we don't like nature when there's a tsunami, or a volcano erupts underwater near Tonga and suddenly everything is swept away. We don't want that. Forest fires, no thank you. Or droughts causing famine, no thank you. We don't want that part of nature, but we do want either the kind of cozy nature, which is gardens and city parks, or even domesticated national parks.
Yosemite, yeah.
Yosemite, or I think one of the amazing things about these Wandervögel in Germany is that they absolutely looked down their noses at people who did youth hosteling. Right. That was, for wusses.
I can relate.
Hardcore. They wanted to be hardcore. But so, deep ecologists would say we can be ecocentric, and we can find ways of living as human beings that don't encroach and that leave nature to heal itself. And we just won't interfere. No more ecocide, no more genocide of species and plants and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, how many billions of us are on the planet? And one form of environmentalism is, I think, is it Murray Bookchin who brings to environmentalism the concept of social justice. If we're going to be serious environmentalists, and this goes back to Humboldt, who says, wealth is all very well, but you can't have wealth before you have justice. And he says, you'll only have secure prosperity if you have justice. And he wrote very respectfully of indigenous peoples in his exploration travels through South America, except when native people were trying to kill him with poisoned arrows. But, for the most part, and he excoriated slavery. And he was a mentor to Simon Bolivar. So there's
Okay.
But so we are constantly jumping back and forth in this cultural schizophrenia between wanting to just exit nature and just, live as humans, but let that be. But we also want to see it in its pristine beauty. But as soon as we insert ourselves, like Ansel Adams or John Muir, hiking in Yosemite with just a copy of Emerson and a tin cup for water and, some acorn meal in your backpack, you're still a human being in Yosemite. And you're coming back and you're writing about Yosemite, as John Muir did. These books about how wonderful it is, and your Ansel Adams taking photographs of how beautiful it is, and that starts a stampede of tourists to Yosemite. Right. So, catch-22 all the way.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I feel like we've been talking a lot of smack about Romanticism, and, I certainly share a lot of those qualities in terms of, being awestruck by mountains, by forests,
and raging rivers, and
and I'm always conscious of wanting to try and create sort of a synthesis position or take the both the best of different schools of thought. And modernity does need to be tempered to some degree, right? And so I kind of see Romanticism perhaps at its best as a sort of balancing force in that. I think we've been in a way sort of ridiculing a lot of the sillier elements. I mean, it functioned, I guess, in ways to deliver a German national identity. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, that's I guess up for debate.
Well, elements of it were a very bad thing.
Yes, sure. But yeah, I mean, do you see? I guess just in closing, is there opportunity for a synthesis here? Are there kind of good qualities or features?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the movement which followed Romanticism in the arts was realism. And as I said, I think I mentioned, politically speaking, there were consequences when instead of just going off into the wilderness or to the Lake District and admiring the moon rising over the lake, you actually looked at the city and looked at the noxious fumes emanating from factories which were located right in cities. And you passed Clean Air Acts, or you passed acts for slum clearance, or no matter how misguided some of those attempts were, or you began to embark on projects for the reform of social conditions. And but why? Because you had some ideal of what was it like to breathe pure air. Well, you knew because you'd been out there hiking in the Lake District or in the German mountains or in the forests. So there was some ideal. And you'd go back to the nature poets of the Romantic era who voiced this notion of the beauty of the natural world and that there was an alternative to reckless, headlong industrialization, which, you didn't get rid of smog, of these lethal toxic smogs in Great Britain until the great killing smog of 1952.
They call it the pea soup smog.
Yeah, and people died.
I think around at least 4,000, but maybe more.
Died.
Yeah,
I mean, people couldn't,
snuffed.
Or they would be run over by buses getting to the hospital because they couldn't see. I think it may have been 1954 that the Clean Air Act was passed. So how long did that take? On the other hand, in England, you didn't get the creation of national parks till after the Second World War. And you had, this is a super thing about synthesis, you had, God forgive me, I forget his name. I just read this article, and I should remember his name.
You've remembered a lot of names so far.
But he's a guy who comes out of the slums of Birmingham or Manchester. He's a factory worker, and he may even been Jewish. And I'm thinking of certain tendencies in Jewish culture which say what's most important is being a people of the book and reading the Torah and not getting out into nature. But he said, why should only suburban people and wealthy people go out and hike in the woods? So he organized people in his factory, especially young people, to go out and to hike in places of scenic beauty. Now, there were no national parks. So these people actually got arrested for trespass.
Oh, wow.
And he led some of these mass trespass movements,
in order to
which led to eventually after the Second World War. This is in the 1930s, to the creation of national parks. So 1864, Yosemite. 1950 something, the creation of the first national park in England. So but so to be inspired by an ideal of yes, let's get out into nature. Let's not try to impose our own human need for creature comforts on nature. Let's go out there just with a backpack and a flask of water, and let's hike. Nowadays, could we do that without our smartphones and our GPS? I don't know, but
Sure.
But so yeah, a synthesis there. But in more general terms, and like in terms of trying to create a synthesis, I would look to a nature writer, an environmental writer, if you like Michael Pollan, who wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. Michael Pollan, sorry, but he also wrote, his first published book was called Second Nature. And he takes on the Romantic tradition in American environmentalism by saying, Thoreau and Emerson taught us how to worship nature, but he didn't teach us how to live with it. And we have to learn how to live with it. And there's there's an English, he's actually an Anglican bishop, he just died, his name John Hapgood, who gives you, if you Google him, you will find a lecture he gave where he distinguishes between 5 different uses of the term nature, which is really interesting. But he also talks about this deep human, not just biophilia, the deep bond humans have that some scientists think we have genetically in our DNA with nature, but also, he says, human beings could not survive as a species without using nature, without exploiting nature. Now, there are ways of, maybe exploitation is a 99 word, we don't want to use that, but how do you harvest natural resources?
And that kind of leads to this eco-modern concern of, or paradigm of whether you harmonize with nature and you, burn charcoal in the woods because it's natural, or whether you decouple in some ways from nature, which sounds kind of horrible, especially to a romantic, I imagine. Like that's a very alienating idea. In terms of trying to use as little of nature as possible, and perhaps doing things that feel unnatural, such as smashing atoms or whatever to create energy, but which can...
But excuse me, atoms are part of nature. They're part of the natural world.
It's all about how we define it. Okay, well, Yeah, I learned a lot there. We were joking before this that we were going to need to sort of have some hyperlinks. I think you did a decent job about introducing some of the cast of characters. We're going to be publishing in the show notes the kind of essay upon which a lot of this is driven upon. So if you enjoyed this, if you wanted to go into a little more depth here and there, we will publish that on the website.
And this will be me, a dwarf standing on the shoulders of giants, i.e. writers,
right,
and people publishing entries in Wikipedia.
Well, speaking of standing on the shoulders of giants, I mean, as a new father, you get greater appreciation for one's own parents, and I feel like I stand on your shoulders. I wish I'd been a better student of this knowledge that you hold.
I wish you'd taken one course from me. That's all. But
here I am. So with that in mind, I have a little present for you, Mom.
Oh my gosh!
You taught me a lot about how to write and communicate.
Okay.
This is actually a poem you wrote for me about teaching me how to read. So.
And it's about horses.
It's about horses, which are dear to me as well.
Which is also part of nature. Oh, darling, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
All right, decouplers, thanks again for joining us. As I said, show notes are going to be awesome for this episode, and thank you so much again for coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
Okay, bye for now.
Bye.